So this is the Navy SEAL way to become unrecognizable in 3 months. And before you assume this is another video telling you to wake up at 4 in the morning and do 1,000 push-ups, it is not. What actually separates the roughly 20% who make it through SEAL selection from the 75 to 80% who quit has almost nothing to do with physical strength. I have spent years studying this methodology, and the moment I understood what actually breaks people in that program versus what they think breaks them, it changed how I built every system I have ever run in my own life. Stick with me, because by the end of this video you will know exactly what that mental mechanism is, and exactly how to install it into a 90-day system that does not require a single military exercise. If this is the kind of content you have been looking for, the kind that gives you real mechanisms instead of empty hype, subscribe before we get into this. Hit the like button too. It tells me you want the actual architecture, not another motivational speech. Let me start with the case itself, because the data here is more specific than most people realize, and it changes the entire way you should think about becoming unrecognizable in 3 months. Navy SEAL selection, known as BUD, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training, has historically produced an attrition rate between 70 and 85%. Some recent classes have seen first-phase attrition spike close to 50% in a matter of weeks. These are not weak candidates walking into that program. Division I athletes, Ivy League graduates, hardened fleet sailors with years of physical conditioning already behind them. People who, by any reasonable physical standard, should be able to handle extreme exertion. And the overwhelming majority of them still do not finish. Here is the detail that matters most. There is a bell at the training compound in Coronado. When a candidate decides they are done, they walk up to that bell and ring it 3 times. No one forces them. No one physically removes them from the program in most cases. It is a voluntary decision, called a drop on request. And the data confirms something that should reshape how you think about your own limits. Voluntary quitting accounts for the vast majority of the attrition rate. Not medical injury, not academic failure. A person, standing in front of a bell, choosing to stop. What actually happened in the moments before each of those rings is the part instructors have talked about extensively, and it reveals the real mechanism behind who finishes and who does not. Former BUDS instructors and graduates describe a consistent pattern. When a candidate's body is exhausted, cold, and in genuine pain, a specific internal process activates. The mind begins constructing reasons to stop that feel completely legitimate in the moment. A minor ache becomes framed internally as an injury serious enough to justify quitting, something instructors call a quinjury, a mental surrender disguised as a physical ailment. The exhausted brain is not lying to the person. It genuinely believes, in that moment, that the body cannot continue, and it is almost always wrong. The training itself is frequently described by instructors and graduates as roughly 90% mental and only 10% physical. Research on selection outcomes backs this up directly. Personality and attitude assessments have been shown to predict graduation more reliably than raw physical performance metrics. Grit, resilience, and adaptability cannot be taught in 6 months. Technical skills like diving or shooting can be taught to almost anyone given enough time. The internal drive that keeps someone moving when their feet are bleeding and they have not slept in 3 days is a different kind of asset entirely. And it is the one instructors are actually screening for. One of the clearest cases of this comes from Mark Devine, a former SEAL commander who was honor man of his BUDS class, meaning he ranked first overall. Devine has spoken extensively about how he did not survive that training on physical dominance. He specifically credits a set of mental techniques, learned partly from a martial arts instructor before he ever arrived at Coronado, with getting him through structured breathing, deliberate visualization, and segmenting an overwhelming challenge into pieces small enough to complete one at a time. He later built a civilian training program based on those same mental techniques, and reported a 90% success rate for civilians who used his method going into their own buds attempt, compared to the standard rate of roughly 20%. That gap is the entire thesis of this video. The same physical training, the same instructors, the same water, the same cold. The variable that moved the needle from 20% to 90% was not conditioning. It was the mental mechanism running underneath the conditioning. Now I want to go deeper into the specific mechanism, because this is the part that most people who talk about SEAL mentality completely skip over, and it is the part that actually transfers to your life without requiring you to do a single burpee in freezing water. The specific technique most associated with this mental control is called box breathing, sometimes referred to as tactical breathing. The pattern is simple. Inhale for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, exhale for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4. Repeat. It sounds almost too simple to matter. The science behind why it works is not simple at all. Your breathing pattern is directly connected to your autonomic nervous system, the internal switchboard that determines whether your body is operating in fight or flight mode or in a regulated, controlled state. When you slow and equalize your breath in this specific pattern, sensors in your lungs and heart send a direct signal to the stress response centers in your brain. The environment is survivable. The extended exhale specifically stimulates the vagus nerve, the body's primary parasympathetic pathway, activating what researchers call the vagal brake. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable physiological mechanism. Research on slow-paced breathing shows it increases heart rate variability, a well-established biomarker of stress resilience and autonomic flexibility, and reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection center. A peer-reviewed study on structured breathwork found measurable reductions in physiological stress markers from just 5 minutes of practice per day. Here is why this matters specifically for Bud and for you. When a candidate is freezing, exhausted, and the mind is screaming to quit, the body is in a full sympathetic activation state. Under that state, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making and long-term thinking, goes partially offline. The decision to quit is not being made by the thinking brain. It is being made by the panicked, threat-detecting, primitive brain, because that is the only part of the brain that is fully online in a full sympathetic state. Box breathing is a direct intervention that partially restores prefrontal function within minutes by mechanically forcing the nervous system out of that state. It does not eliminate the exhaustion or the cold. It restores the ability to make a clear decision despite the exhaustion and the cold. That distinction, restoring decision-making capacity under duress rather than eliminating the duress, is the entire mechanism separating who rings the bell and who does not. This is exactly the mechanism I want to talk about directly, because everything we just covered, the breathing, the nervous system regulation, the restoration of clear decision-making under pressure, is precisely what the K.M.A. method was built to train in a civilian context. 5 minutes a day for mental control and inner calm. You do not need freezing ocean water or an instructor screaming in your face to have moments where your nervous system hijacks your decision-making. It happens on a random Tuesday, when the deadline feels impossible, when the argument with someone you love spikes your heart rate, when the version of you that wants to quit the habit you started 3 weeks ago starts constructing perfectly reasonable-sounding excuses. The mechanism is identical to what happens at Bud. Your body is just less dramatic about it. I use this practice specifically because it trains the same vagal pathway, the same capacity to restore clear thinking when the primitive brain wants to make the decision instead. Point your camera at the QR code on the screen right now, or check the link in the description. 5 minutes a day. This is the training ground for the exact mechanism that determines whether you finish what you start or ring your own bell. Now let's get into how this becomes a real 90-day system. Before I give you the practical protocol, I need to address the turning point directly. because there is a specific mental reframe that changes everything once you actually understand it. The reframe is this: the voice telling you to stop is not a reliable messenger about your actual physical limits. It is a survival mechanism that activates well before your genuine limit, because from an evolutionary standpoint, a body that stops before its true limit survives more often than a body that pushes to true failure. This mechanism kept your ancestors alive. It also means that in modern conditions, where the actual risk of death from continued effort is essentially zero, that same mechanism fires constantly and inaccurately, telling you to stop long before you have to. This idea has been popularized in various forms, most famously in the so-called 40% rule, associated with retired Navy SEAL David Goggins. The idea that when your mind tells you that you are done, you have typically only tapped into about 40% of your actual capacity. The specific number should be treated as a motivational heuristic rather than a precise scientific measurement. There is no peer-reviewed study that validates an exact 40% figure, but the underlying principle it points to is well supported. Perceived exertion and actual physiological limits are not the same thing, and the gap between them is regulated substantially by psychological state, not just physical capacity. The mind quits first, and it quits with a wide margin of error. Understanding this does something specific to how you approach a 90-day transformation. It means the discomfort you feel in week 2, the voice telling you this is too hard, this is not working, you should stop, is not reliable information about whether you should actually stop. It is the same mechanism that puts hands on the bell at Coronado. Recognizing the voice for what it is, rather than obeying it automatically, is the single mental skill that determines whether 90 days produces a different person or produces another abandoned attempt. Now, the application. This is how the mechanism becomes a real, executable 90-day system without a single element of military training involved. The first component is the daily regulation practice. Every morning, before anything else, 5 minutes of box breathing. Inhale 4, hold 4. Exhale 4, hold 4. Repeated for the full 5 minutes. This is not optional, and it is not flexible based on how you feel. This is the training of the vagal pathway that determines whether your decision-making stays online when the day gets hard later. Do this on the easy days specifically, so that the pathway is already trained when the hard day arrives. You do not build the skill during the crisis. You build it in the calm, so it is available during the crisis. The second component is deliberate discomfort exposure, applied responsibly and without the extremity of actual SEAL training. Once per day, choose one moment of voluntary discomfort. A cold shower for the final 60 seconds, a workout set pushed past the point where your mind first says stop, a difficult conversation you have been avoiding. The specific discomfort matters less than the consistent practice of noticing the mental signal to quit and continuing past it by a small, deliberate margin. This is not about suffering for its own sake. It is about training the specific skill of distinguishing between the mind's first quit signal and your actual limit in low-stakes conditions, so the skill is available when the stakes are higher. The third component is goal segmentation, the same technique Mark Divine used during Hell Week. When a challenge feels too large to complete, break it into the smallest possible next unit and focus exclusively on that unit. Not the whole 90 days, not even the whole week, the next single action. Divine has described using this to survive events where the finish line felt impossibly far away, essentially tricking the exhausted mind into continuing by never presenting it with the full scope of what remained. The fourth component is the daily physical foundation, appropriately scaled for civilian life. This is not SEAL training. This is consistent, moderate, sustainable physical output, a combination of resistance training and cardiovascular conditioning, 3 to 5 days per week, structured around actual recovery rather than constant maximal exertion. The physical component of this transformation matters. but it is genuinely the smaller half of what produces the unrecognizable result. The research on BUDS selection is unambiguous on this point. Personality and mental attributes predicted graduation better than physical performance metrics. Apply the same logic here. The body changes as a downstream effect of a mind that no longer negotiates with its own resistance. Here is what 90 days of this actually produces, and I want to walk through it honestly, rather than sell you an unrealistic before and after. Weeks 1 through 3 are the hardest, and this maps directly onto what happens in the first phase of BUD, which is also where the highest concentration of quitting occurs. The daily breathing practice feels mechanical, and its effects are not yet obvious. The discomfort exposure feels genuinely uncomfortable because the vagal pathway has not been trained yet. This is the period where most people who attempt any real change abandon it, because the mind is generating a continuous stream of legitimate-sounding reasons to stop, and the person has not yet built the capacity to recognize those reasons for what they are. Weeks 4 through 8 are where the mechanism starts to become visible. The morning breathing practice starts producing a noticeably faster return to calm during stressful moments throughout the day, not just during the practice itself, because the vagal pathway strengthens with repetition the same way any trained system does. The discomfort exposure starts to feel less like suffering and more like a data point. The mind said stop, and you continued anyway, and nothing catastrophic happened, and that evidence accumulates. The physical training is producing measurable results by this point as well, but more importantly, the person doing the training is now making decisions from a regulated nervous system more consistently than a reactive one. Weeks 9 through 12 are where the transformation becomes what other people notice. And this is not primarily physical, though the physical results are real by this point too. What becomes visible is a person who does not negotiate with their own resistance the way they used to. Someone who hears the internal voice that wants to quit and recognizes it as information to evaluate rather than an order to obey. That shift, more than any physical change, is what people mean when they say someone became unrecognizable. The body follows. The mind leads. One more thing before we close, and I want to be direct about why I am saying this twice in different ways, because it matters. Everything in this 90-day protocol depends on the same underlying capacity, staying regulated enough to make a clear decision when your body and your exhausted mind are both telling you to stop. That capacity is not something you either have or do not have. It is trained, the same way the SEALs who make it through selection trained it, whether they knew that is what they were doing or not. This is a different angle than the QR code moment earlier. This is specifically about who holds up on the bad days, not the easy mornings when discipline feels natural. The days when everything in you wants to ring the bell on the entire 90-day attempt. The K.M.A. method is 5 minutes daily, built for exactly that capacity. It is not about eliminating hard days. It is about staying in control of what you do next when a hard day arrives, instead of letting a panicked nervous system make the decision for you. Link in the description, QR code on the screen. In the comments, tell me one thing you have quit recently that, looking back honestly, you probably had more left in the tank for. Not a list. One specific thing. I read every comment, and I build future content from what actually comes up. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the voice telling them to stop is not as reliable as they think it is. Not because they are weak, because nobody ever showed them the actual mechanism behind that voice. Subscribe if you are building the version of yourself that does not ring the bell. This is exactly the kind of content this channel exists to make. 90 days from now, you are either the person who understood this mechanism and used it, or you are the person who watched this video and did nothing different. The bell is always there. Whether you walk toward it is the only variable that has ever mattered. Start today.